Hi, my name is Troy Jensen, and you're listening to U.S. Gov Teachers Unplugged.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th,
Without objection, 5-minute voting will continue. Without objection, order. Without objection, 5-minute voting will continue. The unfinished business is on the vote and the motion of the gentleman from Illinois.
Thanks for tuning in today. We will be discussing the famous case of Lemon v. Kurtzman and the Lemon Test, a test used by the Supreme Court to determine if a law violates the First Amendment. Joining me is a fellow teacher of government and AP government.
Hi, I'm clasue. I teach government at Riverton High School in Riverton, Utah.
Okay. So, just to really start us off, what is a Lemon Test before we even get going on our conversation?
Well, what we really need to talk about first is the background of the whole case. The Supreme Court case is Lemon v. Kurtzman, and it starts in the 1960s when the states of Pennsylvania and Rhode Island both passed laws which provided government money, state money, to provide textbooks, instructional materials, and then also to kind of help build up teacher salaries, to augment teacher salaries. And these were all teachers who were teaching secular subjects, math, science, social studies. But because the funds were going to non-public schools, a lot of non-public schools being religious, some taxpayers had a real problem with that. They felt like government money was being spent on religious schools, and they felt like that was a violation of the First Amendment, particularly that part of the First Amendment that we call the Establishment Clause, that says that governments cannot establish or favor religion. And the district court sided with the taxpayers and said, yeah, you're right, they can't do this. But the appeal went all the way to the Supreme Court, and what we have is the results of the Lemon versus Kurtzman case.
Okay. So, with this case, the Supreme Court held that, really any law passed by the government that related to religion had to pass like these three qualifying, indicators. The law must have a, secular legislative purpose. The law's, primary effect must not promote or inhibit religion. And the law must really not, excessively entangle government and religion. And I always thought that, specifically when it comes to the Lemon Test and this idea of church and state, something that always stood out to me is, people always really talk about like, well, there should be a defining indicator between, church and state. And we do have the Lemon Test, but, Madison really didn't have that agreement, about like this church and state. Like with the Establishment Clause, it kind of left it open. Is what I'm trying to say.
Right. In fact, that phrase, church and state, doesn't even come from the Constitution, right? It comes from a letter from Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah. Well, he was in France, writing a Baptist minister, So I always think this it's kind of a misconception that a lot of people have.
Yeah.
So, let's just kind of, talk a little bit more about it. Based on the Lemon Test, why is it constitutional to allow students release time in order to attend seminary? I know that's a big thing in Utah.
Yeah. And, I've run into this question several times with my own students in my government classes. And really, with any questions like that, we just have to apply it to the Lemon Test. Does that law that allows students release time for seminary have a secular legislative purpose? Meaning, is it a non-religious purpose? Students who choose to use it for seminary, certainly for them, it's a religious purpose. But as far as the school is concerned, the students are just taking release time. They could be using that for any number of things, which does give it a secular purpose. It definitely doesn't it certainly promotes religion, but notice the Lemon Test says that the law's primary effect can't be to promote religion. And a law that allows students to take time out of school to do something else doesn't have the primary effect to promote religion. And certainly if the school's principal was required to hire the seminary teachers, then that would excessively entangle the government and religion. But because the seminary institutes work totally separate from the school, there's no excessive entanglement there. And so the idea that students can leave school for a class period to go study religion on their own or with an independent organization holds up to all three prongs of the Lemon Test.
Okay, good. One thing I always wondered, I know both me and you are in athletics, that we do coaching, right, and then we do different things. Why in the state of Utah do we not have games on on Sundays?
Yeah, I always figured it was probably because people just aren't going to show up.
Yeah. Honestly, could that be an issue? We could talk about that a little bit later, but I always thought that was kind of weird. Like, why can't we have sporting events or sanctioned events on Sundays? And people might not show up, but what if, you have a school that is, primary Jewish, right? Where they don't celebrate their Sabbath on Sunday, right? So couldn't they still do it on a Sunday or be able to compete on a Sunday? I guess, it's like, how far does that entanglement go between church and state? Right.
It's definitely going to exist. And that's why I think on the second point, it's really important to remember that its primary effect can't be to promote or inhibit religion, right? That has to be the primary effect. Yeah. So I got a question for you. Based on this Lemon test, then, why can schools, because again, we're operating out of Utah, and here in Utah, the schools are required to give students an opportunity to say the pledge in the morning, and it's optional, but they are required to do it. And so, based on that Lemon test, why would it be constitutional to allow students to say the pledge when the pledge clearly states the words "under God"?
So the pledge is something that always comes up, specifically in my government classes. We've seen a couple of years ago with people that were taking a knee for, the national anthem. And I've had students ask, it's like, well, why can't I do the same thing for the Pledge of Allegiance? Well, they have every right to do so. Right. We say that this term, under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, we have to remember that the Pledge of Allegiance, or the original Pledge of Allegiance, did not have those terms under God in it. This under God phrase was added during the Cold War scare, specifically to kind of promote a sense of nationalism. Now, was that a issue with, a discrepancy with church and state? It could be. Yeah, without a doubt. It can be. But it's the way it really works out when we go to the Pledge of Allegiance, is the fact that kids are not required to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, I've had teachers come up and tell me, hey, I should require my kids to say the Pledge of Allegiance. No. It's, just because that phrase under God or all of these different things, we cannot, because that would be a violation of their First Amendment, right? The freedom of speech, freedom of religion. So now you have two conflicting constitutional arguments here. You have, that freedom of speech, which is kind of the opposite side of the Lemon test, and the freedom of religion, so they almost like combat against each other. And the Supreme Court has really kind of applied that differently over the years. Originally, you had these strict constitutionalist judges who really applied it, well, if it's not in the Constitution, we can't do that. But during the Civil Rights era, it really changed to where you had more of these kind of a loose constitutionalist, where they were kind of picking and choosing and using, the precedent of former cases to really make their decision, not necessarily the Constitution itself. Back to, your original question about the Pledge of Allegiance, no kids are required to really say it, but because, it's kind of like an older tradition, we still do it.
So one of the things that I think is interesting, and this is something we actually will probably need to talk about in a couple minutes, but it applies to the pledge in that a school having a student-led voluntary prayer would be unconstitutional and would violate the Lemon test. So the pledge is not is voluntary, but a prayer that's not voluntary would still be a violation. Yeah. So what do you think the difference is between those two things?
So I think when it's a student-led prayer, I think it's an organized thing, and it's not going to pass a Lemon test. Like, we must look back at, the law must not excessively entangle government and religion, with that one specifically when it comes to a student-led prayer. Now, this question really comes up because in the Bible Belt, your student body officers, there used to be people that would be assigned chaplain. Specifically, like a student body chaplain who would lead prayers. Now you have an entanglement because that student body officer is elected by the school officials and the student body, and they are now leading an organized prayer. That's a big entanglement, and it's not going to pass the Lemon test. I believe there was a court case back in Texas where they were it was a Catholic school, and they were leading before football games, leading a Pledge of Allegiance, or not a Pledge of Allegiance, but a school-wide prayer. And there was I think it was an LDS girl that really took it to the Supreme Court because it was a violation. She felt that she was kind of outed by, her student body.
Right. So the fact that it has this notion, I think, by the way, I think that's Santa Fe versus Independent School District.
Yeah.
Santa Fe Independent School District versus Dell. But this fact that, the words under God are kind of ancillary to the real main purpose of the pledge, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, whereas the purpose of a prayer would be absolutely religious and have that
absolutely. Yeah. I think it's funny that they used to elect student body chaplains. I think that's absolutely crazy. But I grew up in a different generation where we didn't have that. But you think about like the Bible Belt states where that was kind of a thing, that was tradition.
Right.
One thing that always kind of like blows my mind is watching a congressional session. Like, how do they open up any session?
All with prayer, always with prayer.
And there's
Congress has a chaplain, just like Congress has an official chaplain. You can go to their website and read the text of every prayer that they've offered.
Yeah. Some city councils still do it, which is funny because in Utah, they don't do it as much. Now, I have been to some city council meetings in Utah where they still do it. These are more in the rural areas. But for the most part, most city council meetings in the state of Utah don't have prayers.
I've been to a few that do, but it does seem to be kind of a dying thing.
So just based on the Lemon test, Cliff, why is it unconstitutional to provide government funding to religious schools?
Well, it would be unconstitutional if they were providing government funding exclusively to religious schools. But if government funding is being provided to all schools, if the state decided to, pass a grant that provided money for every state in the school to buy calculators or Chromebooks for their students, it would be unconstitutional for the religious schools to not get that money.
Yeah.
And that absolutely passes the Lemon test. Again, like if it's for teaching a secular purpose, if it's for teaching a secular subject, then obviously the law has a secular purpose. If its primary effect would definitely not be promoting religion, it'd be promoting learning math or science in religious schools as well as public schools. And there certainly wouldn't be any excessive entanglement. In fact, you might argue that it would entangle the government and religion even more if the government was trying to exclude those religious schools from that funding.
Yeah. I always wondered this question specifically for BYU and Notre Dame, who have specific like religious classes, and a lot of those students, they could apply for a student loan, which is federal money, that is loaned out, or even like a Pell Grant, which is, federal aid for, higher education. And how are they paying for those classes? Do those classes, I don't know, maybe this is a separate question. Like, can you pay for those classes with a Pell Grant?
Yeah, certainly you can, but again, I think it goes back to what is the purpose. The religious classes are ancillary to the main purpose of going to the college, which is to get your degree, right?
Yeah.
And that's definitely a secular purpose.
Yeah.
I think it would be different, though, and tell me your thoughts on this, if they were to be providing religious instruction then in a public school, not a university, and not a private Catholic school or private religious school, but if a public school itself, if they provided religious courses on campus, not during release time, how might that be different?
So I guess this is maybe a question that I've had myself. And the only assumption that I could really have with this, if we were to provide funding for, outside non-release time classes, would be that not all students going, because it's a public education, it's a public school, that not all students would be going to that class. Correct. Now, if you made it a required class to where if a kid is a different religion and they have to attend that religious class, then you would have an issue because now their freedom of religion is being taken away. They don't have that choice to take that class or not because it's a required class. Now, I've heard, horror stories to where this actually does happen. But for the most part, I think most of the Western states are very kind of liberal with their ideology on public education. I think it's a lot of these more conservative ideologies back east that kind of still practice, where certain religious classes are required. But for the state mandates, no classes are really required when it comes to religion. Not that I know of. Do you know of any?
No. I mean, there's and some that I've seen that are options are religious studies courses, and those you're studying world religions. You're studying them comparatively as a social science rather than as an adherent to the religion.
Yeah. And when it comes to education, we have to be careful. Really, those world religions classes, those comparative issues classes, I mean, we have to be careful what we say, because even just with what we do as government teachers, we can't promote our science really to kids, our own personal opinions when it comes to what our political beliefs are. And as like a religious class, you would technically be promoting your religious beliefs on the students, right?
Right. And one of the things I use this example with my students often. I tell them, like, if you came into class and you said, "Hey, we have a tough test today, Mr. Stribby, can I run in the hall real quick and say a quick prayer? Because I'm scared." If I told you no, I'd be violating your right to exercise your religion. But if I allowed you to conduct that prayer in class and with the rest of the students, because I'm just assuming everybody's scared of the test, then I'm going to be violating their religious rights as well, the Establishment Clause. So really, governments have to walk a tightrope between these two things: protecting people's right to practice religion and protecting people from an established religion.
So let's talk about Congress. Okay.
Yeah. I love this.
Congress, what they do really throws us through a loop, because like as educators and in a classroom, we can't do what Congress does when it comes to religion. We can't have a chaplain. We can't have an open prayer. We can't do those things, but Congress does. And these are elected officials that are supposed to represent the people, right? Like the House of Representatives, I love watching them because they are the true representation of the people. Okay. They adjourn on Sundays and only work weekdays. For that point, now you're promoting Christian ideology, correct? Like, what about people whose Sabbath is not on a Sunday? There is just so many things. There's religious imagery, there's paintings in the U.S. Capitol, even in the Utah State Capitol. I went up there last summer and I went into the Gold Room. Do you know what the Gold Room is?
Yeah.
So, and they've got this picture of like Brigham Young and all of these different religious apostles up there. And I was like, isn't this wouldn't this be an issue when it comes to discrepancy between church and state?
One of the things, and again, we got to keep going back to the Lemon Test. And here I think that's the secular purpose, right? Yeah. Because in the case of like some of the religious imagery up on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., there is a relief sculpture of Moses there, right? Yeah. But when you look at the other relief sculptures that are around him, it's other lawmakers in history. They're not looking at Moses as a religious leader. They're looking at him as a lawmaker, right? Yeah. Because the Ten Commandments, right, essentially they're a law. And it's the same thing, right? If you go up and go into the Gold Room up there and you see that image of Brigham Young, is it an image of Brigham Young as a religious leader, or is it an image of Brigham Young as a settler and a founder of the state of Utah? Yeah. The problem is he's both. But it gives them the opportunity to put those things there, at least serving a secular purpose. Yeah, I agree.
It's one of those things that I've always kind of felt was difficult to really understand. Another thing about Congress is religious leaders often meet with members of Congress or the president. What was the name of the religious leader during the Obama administration? He was a big New York guy. What is his name?
Yeah, we're gonna have to come back to that.
But anyways, like they were constantly meeting with him, right? Even
like every president meets with the Pope.
Yeah, right? Every president meets with the Pope.
Totally happens.
JFK, Martin Luther King, Lyndon Johnson, Martin Luther King. I mean, he was a religious leader, but he was also a civil rights activist. And then it kind of goes back to the Lemon Test. What was, the original intent of meeting with these religious leaders? What was the effect? Was he trying to promote the religion, or was it more of something else? Was he trying to promote civil rights with Martin Luther King?
There are so many meetings. One of my favorites to look carefully at is when you look at the fact that the Supreme Court justices on the Sunday prior to their the beginning of their session every year, there is a mass held in Washington, D.C. By the Roman Catholic Church called the Red Mass. And its purpose is to to pray for the judges as they go into this next session. And not every justice attends it, but many justices do, and they attend it as a public event, right?
Yeah.
And that's happening in a religious building, and it is a religious service.
Yeah. So it's kind of funny. Have you ever heard of the National Prayer Breakfast?
Right.
Yeah.
It's same thing. So do these things pass? How do these things hold up to the Lemon test then? Because they're happening for sure.
Yeah. So, let's go back to the Lemon test. The law must have a secular legislative purpose. The law's primary effect must not promote or inhibit religion, and the law must not excessively entangle government and religion. Now, with the National Prayer Breakfast, a lot of those people that are at the National Prayer Breakfast, they're meeting with legislators, and a lot of these individuals are kind of they're hobbying, right? They're hobbyists in a way. They're not paid, to motivate legislation. So, we're going to deem them hobbyists, but they're still motivating legislation, right?
You mean lobbyists?
Yeah. So yeah.
Lobbyists.
Yeah. So they're almost lobbying, but I mean, they're obviously not paid. So that's why I use the term hobbyist, right?
Oh yeah. Okay. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Hobby lobby.
Hobby lobbyist.
But it's absolutely true. And that's really the thing. If you're a political leader, you don't get to pick and choose. Lobbyists come to you, and some of those lobbyists might be from religious organizations, but you don't get to ignore them just because they are, right? So as a political leader, you meet with lobbyists. If they're from a religious group, that's still a secular purpose, right? Does it promote or inhibit religion? It certainly does, but is that its primary purpose?
Yeah.
Right.
So, one case that hasn't made it to the Supreme Court yet, but that I've been watching very closely was a case of Joe Kennedy. Have you heard about this case?
What do you got to say about that?
So in Joe Kennedy, so he was a football coach back in Washington, I believe, and he would have a prayer after every football game. He would go out to the 50-yard line by himself, and he would have a prayer. Well, students started to join in on this prayer, and parents kind of got upset about what he was doing. Now, he didn't encourage students. He didn't do, any of those things that would qualify underneath the Lemon test, but he was still having that prayer on school grounds. He was terminated from his position because he was leading this prayer. Now, this is where I have conflict being an educator. If students have that right to have a prayer whenever they want to, shouldn't educators have that right?
I think just like a lot of people, we do give up certain rights when we step into the classroom, right? I can't just say whatever I want. I have to be really careful about the things I say. And I certainly do give up some of my rights, including my religious ones. It doesn't mean I can't pray at school, but there's a difference between saying a quick prayer like in a prep period when students aren't around, or quietly in my head or something like that, than there is if I were to say a prayer in front of the class.
Yeah.
Right. And from what you said, it sounds like Joe Kennedy was saying those prayers publicly.
Yeah.
Right? No one's policing what's in his head. They're policing what he's doing as a government representative standing in front of a crowd of people.
Yeah. Now, I guess it kind of gets back to the Lemon test, and we have to really just kind of understand what the Lemon test is. Now, are you going to have cases when it comes to the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause? Yes, you're always going to have these different cases. And I think a lot of it goes back to the type of justices that are in the Supreme Court. During the Civil Rights era, do I think cases would have been different than today? Yes, I do, without a doubt. Do, these very prominent, important cases, Roe v. Wade, just Roe v. Wade. Do I think even Roe v. Wade would have passed today? No, because I think more of our court today is more strict constitutionalist, whereas back then they were kind of a loose constitutionalist.
Right. And those strict constitutionalists are gonna hold up to that a lot differently than a loose constitutionalist would. I think we just always every time one of these things comes up, recent ones like they were putting crosses up next to the highway in Utah to memorialize highway patrolmen who have died. And while some of those were on private land, some of them weren't. They were on public land, and they bore the official seal of the Utah Highway Patrol. But is the purpose of that cross to do something religious or not? We have to look at the Lemon Test. Every single time one of these things comes up, we have to ask ourselves, does that law have a secular purpose? Is the law's primary effect to promote or inhibit religion? And does the law excessively entangle government and religion? And when it passes all three of those, religions might benefit sometimes from those things. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that benefit was the purpose of the government action.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Cliff, just for kind of meeting with having this discussion with me today about, the Lemon Test. I learned a lot, I think we really covered a lot of the stuff that is really important when it kind of comes down to the Lemon Test.
Absolutely. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.